All right. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our discussion of the Tolkien films. So we have, this is our third session where we've been talking. We did one for each of the two trailers in anticipation of this. And now, of course, we want to discuss the film itself now that it's been out for a little bit and everyone's had a chance to see it, hopefully. If not, pause and go see it and then come back.
I'd say spoilers, but we have years and years of information about Tolkien's life. So if you think there's spoilers, you're missing out on something somewhere else.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. No, there's no so it's all good. So I would be happy to, so for those of you who are familiar with how this works, we've got hang on a second, speaking of being familiar with how this works. So just realizing that I'm having a small, there's my question box. My question box was hiding from me and I had to recover it, and now I've recovered it. And there we go. Okay. So, sorry, my question box is still hiding from me. Where did it go? I don't know.
You guys are used to it. Talk amongst yourselves for a minute.
Good grief. Okay. All right. There we go. Phew. All right. No, never mind. I'm just going to change my approach here. Oh, dear. For some reason, things keep shifting around on me. No problem. Different tack, and we will be fine. This is primarily for I know, like, people who are watching on GoToWebinar are like, what's happening? I don't see any change whatsoever. But the people who are watching on Twitch and on the recording certainly will, as I'm trying to get things on the correct display so that I can actually see your questions. All right.
Oh, I don't have Twitch open. I should do that, shouldn't I?
Oh, it's all good. Yeah, my questions box was being very, very stubborn. Okay, so so as I was saying before I got interrupted when I noticed my questions box had disappeared, put comments in the questions box. If you have any, I would really love to hear feedback. I'd love to, not only give our, we want to not only give our own reactions, but, respond to questions or issues or concerns that you guys had. I'm going to say right off and I'm also looking at the Twitch chat as well, by the way, for those of you who are on Twitch. So I've got both of those open. That one's behaving. Quick reactions. I loved this movie. Like, I loved it. I can't even believe it. I've been spending weeks trying to wrap my brain around the fact that I love this movie. I can't, like
you weren't allowed to.
Holy cow. It's like one of those things, right? If you had told me 6 months ago that I was going to love the Tolkien, a biopic, I'd be like, you must be insane. That is never going to happen. But it did. I'm not saying there's nothing to criticize, I'm not saying that it's perfect in every way, but I thought it was a great film. I really enjoyed it. I thought, it was, I am stunned. Maggie, in our discussions before, I was talking about how my dread was slightly decreasing, right? But that was
but you were still super tentative,
I was.
It's a carefully optimistic, and now you're just whole hog fanning out.
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, Tomas, that was one of the things that, of course, I've heard many people say, one like very immediate reaction to seeing the film and where it ended. I heard people being like, oh, I was really disappointed that we got no Inklings, right? But like, obviously, they weren't talking about that part of his life. It's a really different chapter in his life, many years after this part.
I feel like I had to split it up a bit, where I had like my immediate reaction, and then anytime I've looked at a film, I've always done what I liked, what I do differently, so like maybe we want to structure it that way of just like, the immediate reaction, I was the same as you, super entertained, really enjoyed it. Quite a few bits were a little too on the nose for me and made me roll my eyes a little, and we could go through those, but in general, like, I was weeping at the end. I absolutely loved it. Some of those shots were beautiful. I know in my notes, like, I wrote down you can see how messy these are. In the dark theater, I was writing notes, and at the very end, it just says, Jeffrey's poems, all the crying.
Oh my goodness. The first time I saw the film, the scene with Tolkien and Smith's mom, oh man.
Oh my God.
During
I don't know if I could talk about it yet.
Holy cow! Yeah, yeah. No, I mean it was very moving. It was very moving.
Yeah, and it really hit all the emotional points that you want it to. You know, you connect with this young Tolkien. I think the way they played his mother as the like inspired storyteller and keeping him thinking, keeping him dreaming, that was really beautiful. And losing her so early, and I mean that whole introduction to the Tolkien that we know was a really well handled, really lovely. And yeah, I'm like I'm too overwhelmed already. How do we want to structure it? Go from the beginning to the end, or talk about emotional cores, or start crying again?
Well, I feel like well, I don't know whether we should necessarily begin with this, but I feel like the biggest issues that I've heard, or the biggest kind of concerns, the sort of the largest issues to address, are essentially what's in the movie and what's not in the movie. Basically, I heard many fewer objections to like specific things that happen in the film, right? I mean, I'm not saying there are none of those, but the biggest questions, the biggest concerns I had for I've heard from people have been those like, why didn't they talk about this? Why is this not in there? Kind of things. So kind of thinking about the really big picture first, the overall kind of dominant guiding choices of the film before we start talking about individual elements through maybe would make sense. But so that first one with the Inklings thing, right? And actually I think this was something that Brenton Dickinson said. And by the way, I really, really enjoy. So a general plug for Brenton's blog, A Pilgrim in Narnia, a really, really good blog. And he's had some really smart things to say about the Tolkien film, which he also really liked. And one of the things that he said, which really I hadn't been thinking of it in those terms, but as soon as he said it, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly right. He said a lot of people seem to be mistaking the genre here. Like, this is not a documentary on Tolkien's life. This is a biopic, right? And that's a different thing. Like, they are telling a particular story. They are dramatizing things in a particular. They're trying to depict elements of his life. It's not a documentary. It's not designed to sort of march you through the history of Tolkien's life. And so people who are like, oh, but they skipped all these things, or they changed. They weren't exactly true to the chronology, or why did they stop right at that point? Because that was the story. In our when I got together with a couple New England folks here and we saw the movie together and then talked afterwards, I'm forgetting now which one of them said this, unfortunately, but one of the things that one of the folks was saying is that he was characterizing the film. He said, really, it's an origin story, right? It's sort of like a how he got his superpowers kind of story, and I that seems to me right. The way that it builds up to we end with the first line of The Hobbit, because that's the point of the film, is to show what formed him, how did he get there, and that's a totally different thing from documentary of Tolkien's life.
Yeah, and in terms of a film adaptation and creating a 90-minute or 95-minute, because I think this is 93 minutes, it's like bang on an hour and a half. In terms of creating something that structured, you have to make some pretty significant decisions about what to keep and what to get rid of. So I have this talk a lot when I do lectures on adaptation, because you're taking 600-page text and turning it into maybe 2 hours maximum of film, and a minute on film is a page of text, but you can't have that long. So most scripts are 90 to 110 pages. So all this stuff about bringing it down. And I know when I was working on the Harry Potter stuff, they kept talking about all the things that were missed out. We missed spew. We missed, all these lovely moments that of course we love as readers. But if you have all of that on screen, you're going to have a 9-hour Harry Potter film, which I'm totally on board with. But the tickets would be like £100 each. So that's not going to happen. So you have to make these decisions, and they said for Harry Potter, they chose the lens as Harry. So Harry was the lens. Anything that happened on screen was exactly what immediately affected Harry's story. So I kept thinking about this with the Tolkien film, and I think the lens has to be the growth of Tolkien and the relationship with Edith. Which is funny because so much of it is about his friends, but his relationship with Edith is what got to the Tolkien that we know. She pushed him on. She enabled the story. She did so much work copying his stuff over and making those works happen.
Yes.
That wouldn't have happened without him growing up into the person he was because of his friends. So all of it had to lead into this. Yeah, so for me, the lens, and yes, we missed out on a lot of stuff, but it had to affect Edith and Tolkien or we wouldn't get it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I thought they did an amazing number of things in the scope that they had. You know, I mean, again, a lot of people want to talk. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people want to talk about the stuff that they didn't cover, but goodness, the stuff that they did cover. I mean, the from the trailers, I was expecting that they would, you know, try to do justice to his relationship with Edith and make that, you know, a good story, which they did. I also was, you know, it's also was pretty clear that they were going to focus on his relationship with the TCBS and make that into a full and good story, which they did. Then on top of that, they did much more with his language and language development and the relationship of Joseph Wright, and also like that wonderful conversation with Edith in the restaurant where we begin to get a glimpse of the link between language and story and of course the connections between the conversation with Edith earlier and the conversation with Joseph Wright later. So I mean, his relationship with language and how stories emerge from language, like that was a plot line I never guessed that they were going to attempt. And they did.
And how they used those opportunities to build other stuff. So like it wasn't like let's have a completely unrelated conversation where we talk about language. Let's use language as a way to build the relationship between Tolkien and Edith. Like that was such a great caveat to show how they work, how she challenges him, how they push each other into like silliness and creativity while still establishing how freaking hot Tolkien was at languages. So that was a really great moment of like, wow, you're really good at this. As well as tit for tat, I can hold my own against you, Tolkien. Don't get so cocky. I love that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Trish says that was one of the things that she liked. Carpenter was not exactly complimentary of Edith in his biography, Trish says, and it was interesting to see a characterization of her like this, and also to really the way that they kind of got inside her story as well, right? I mean, I think even Tolkien fans can kind of forget, right?
Yeah.
Yes, Tolkien was an orphan and grew up in a boarding house. So did Edith, you know, and like what was her story?
I was going to save this for later, but one of my favorite bits was where she introduces them to the TCBS, and then he gets jealous of like, oh wait, you're having this conversation, I can't, and she shows him up where she's like, how dare you? I don't get to do this. I found people who are my mental match. And they're challenging me and they're asking me questions, things I'm interested in, and you took it away from me, you bastard. I absolutely loved that. So again, you can see how that builds such a strong, wonderful relationship later, because from the very beginning, she can match him.
Right.
So yeah. Right. And she has her moment to shine as well when they go to the opera at the ring cycle. And of course we get that on the nose, it's a battle for one ring, and all these things that you can see potentially inspires later. But she also gets to show off. You know, she gets to say what she knows about this and why it's important. And I absolutely love that. Yeah, she's not just a pretty thing on his arm. She's really a character in her own right.
Yeah. No, it was that was remarkable, I thought. But yeah, so I mean, all of these things happening, right? And then it's been the thing that's been hardest for me, is people have been like, oh, but they didn't do this and they didn't do that. I'm like, what do you want? Holy cow! Like,
they're never going to do all of it. Yeah,
exactly. So they can't possibly.
If we did a different film with his Christianity as the lens, that would be a very different film, and I think it would be fascinating. I would love to see how his faith grows and is challenged and all of that. But that wasn't the lens of this one. That wasn't the lens of this one. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And let's actually, I mean, do you mind talking about that? I mean, you've raised that issue, and that's, I think, certainly the biggest issue that I've heard, the biggest, the number one thing, the biggest thing that I really wanted to address was the issue of his Catholicism and, you know, that being absent. This was something, Maggie, you and I noticed right away about the trailers, right? After our discussions of the trailers, I was not going in expecting much about his Catholicism, and we didn't get it.
And we know that fans were noticing that, and more than fans, like whole religious groups were noticing that and writing articles about it and raising it as an issue. And I recognize that, and it's hard to find successful people from this age that you can talk openly about the religion that created fantasy lit, and all the things that came after that. So I understand the frustrations. I think it's just kind of become a bigger signpost than it should be, because I'm a little too simplistic about it, and I guess too practical about it. We're like, that's not what the point of this film was. It's something else.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it wasn't about what you wanted it to be, but it's not. So get on it.
Well, that's it. I mean, they had to make choices, and they didn't talk about that. But there are two challenges that I would make to people who have that objection. And I hope that everyone who is watching and listening to me understands my own sympathies. I am a Christian, and I think most people know that I am quite sympathetic to the importance of Tolkien's Christianity to his writing. So I hope everybody knows that that's the personal framework that I am coming from. And yet I would issue two challenges to people who object to this. Number one, during the time period that they are talking about, what is the impact of Tolkien's Christianity? This is the time period in which his Catholicism was, in fact, he went a whole year without even going to Mass during the period of time that was covered by this. I mean, it is not hard to argue. Like, yes, of course, when you look at his whole life and you look at his works and everything, his Catholicism was enormously important to him. But exactly how much did it form him at this period? He was not engaging with it very much. And my sense always of Tolkien's life has been that his Catholicism was very important to him with his mom as a kid, and then also very much after he got married and settled down and began to attend Mass regularly and had kids. But during this time of his life, it is not at all obvious to me. And when you read when you read the Book of Lost Tales, it is even less obvious to me. The stuff that he is writing in this time I mean, I'm not saying there isn't stuff there. Like, yes, there's like allegories about purgatory and heaven and hell. He's interested in things. I'm not saying there's no interest there, but I am saying, like, I don't think there is the same kind of storyline here. When we're looking at these threads, right? These threads that form Tolkien at this point in his life, the point that the time in his life that the film is engaging with, his Catholicism is less prominent than it was in other times in his life. That I think is simply true. The second thing, though, and this is even more important, I hear people say, why didn't they cover more of his? What exactly would you have wanted to see? Yeah. What would have made you happy? People who want to see his Christianity, his Catholicism, what story precisely? Like, rather than just saying, oh, it's not there, what would you put if you were doing the film? Or even better, please. And I mean this because I'd love to see it personally. Tell me, design a film. Give me an outline of a story that does a good job, Maggie, of exactly what you said, like a different film with a different lens, I would love to see that.
But if that's the story, but if that's the story you were telling, if my whole purpose was to tell the Catholic story through the Catholic lens, this isn't the time period I would choose. There were other periods that were much stronger. So yes, I mean, if their point was to show the coming of age and they wanted this, which I can see from a professional standpoint and the studio standpoint, that would be more attractive because it's the lesser known story, it's wider appeal, it's the break of World War I. It's all of those beautiful, beautiful costumes and settings of Oxford 1910s. That is a stunning setting. So that's the stuff that I would have focused in on. And if you want wide appeal and your Fox Searchlight pictures and you're already an indie print trying to appeal to a wide audience, you're going to keep it as broad as you can. So you're not going to focus on the Catholic lens. And if you are, that's not the time period you choose.
No, it's not. But like I said, I think that something could be done with that, right? But what exactly could be done with that? I certainly do not think that it could be that the role of his Catholicism in his worldview and in his writing, I really don't think it could have been jammed into this film. And I would say, I think it would be way worse if it had been jammed half-heartedly in this film.
It would feel jammed. That's the issue.
Let's add a random scene of him praying the rosary or something. Like, seriously, what do people want to see?
Sorry.
No,
I get excited.
the significance, like the social significance of his Catholicism was present, right? You know, his mom talking about how good the church had been to him. Father Francis was not made into a villain, right? You know, he wasn't made into this like
loving,
heartless celibate, out of touch with reality. But I mean, that scene between him and Tolkien when he forbade him to see Edith, I thought was very moving, and I was very sympathetic.
And it made sense as a caretaker, you know, like if that's his role, and I see that you're connecting with this girl, and you know, high five, I'm supportive of that and everything. However, you just got into Oxford, so you need to focus on this. And if you still like her at 21, go for it. So like that's like a pretty good middle ground in terms of like, I'm your caretaker.
Yeah, no, exactly. And especially since, again, this is an element of Tolkien's biography not often emphasized. One of his biggest issues in this period of his life is he was a slacker. Like he was he almost flunked out of Oxford because he was a slacker, because he didn't do his work, and he got a second, almost a third on his first exam. Like he almost flunked his exam.
And he only succeeded because he changed departments and petitioned his way into it by writing 5,000 words on Norse influence on Gawain. Like, that was amazing. You have 24 hours to turn this around. That's when we get to see the slight genius, though, too, because those are the moments that you hang on to of, like, wow, he really is incredibly gifted. Like, I love it when his friends banded together and said, you're the smartest of all of us. You deserve to be here the most. Amazing. I love that kind of recognition from his buddies. And then impressing the language guy who was, you know, the one that wrote the book that he took out from the library. And then the fact that he actually turned around this essay, because we presume he did, because he got into the department. So, yeah, complete slacker. But when pressed and supported, he could turn around and be the Tolkien that we all kind of hold him up to be on our platforms.
Absolutely.
And the bit with the Inklings, the bit at the end, I kind of talked myself in and out of that. Like, I like how it ended. I enjoyed seeing those words going to page because, you know, in the hole in the ground there was a hobbit. Great, we all know where this is going. That's so lovely that he made it through that. My partner and I were talking, wouldn't it have been cool if he was writing that in the pub and C.S. Lewis walked in and sat down with him? I was like, yes, but that's too on the nose. I don't think I want that. If he was writing it in The Eagle and Child, though, that would have been enough for me to be like, oh, yes. You know, like, bang on, you knew where he was. That was the only bit I think I would have slightly changed, but maybe it was a more conscious decision to have him with his family to show that he's come full circle and that's his priority now. He's writing it because he's surrounded by his family. See, talked myself in and out of it again.
Exactly. No, it's I definitely think well, I mean, there's so much. Certainly there's more that could have been done, but yeah, I can't. And so, yeah, so just to reiterate my final challenge to everybody who thought that his Catholicism was neglected, like, band together, or like I'd love to have a totally separate session, just like with a panel of disappointed Catholics to talk through, like, what would a good Tolkien's Catholicism film look like? I would love to see that film. One final plug, I've mentioned Brenton's blog, and I wanted to actually, I'll send it out in the chat here, and I will put it on, I'll put it on Twitch too. His review that he wrote of the film, which was actually a guest blog that was posted on a different blog, a guest post, which I thought actually raised the question really, really interestingly. In fact, he made what was to me a kind of a mind-blowing connection between fan reactions to the Tolkien film and to Tolkien adaptations in general, and Christian art in general, and why, like, not only why is Tolkien's Christianity discussed less in this film, but why are, like, there so few good films about Christianity at all? It was a really mind-blowing discussion. So I just wanted to share that. I thought that Brenton's discussion was really, really smart there. Anyway, so Trish, I do agree that I also think it was good the Inklings were left out. I didn't miss the Inklings one bit. I mean, did the fanboy in me kind of, I mean, Maggie, as you say, kind of want to get at least a cameo from C.S. like have him at least pass C.S. Lewis in the quad or something, you know,
or take a book out after him or something, right, so that
right.
something.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you know, part of me that shamelessly wanted that, but no. I mean, I thought it wouldn't have been the story as it was. The post-war, you know, the post-hospital, right, portion of the film was a little bit like an epilogue, right? I mean, and a relatively long epilogue for an epilogue. You know, felt a little bit detached from the rest of the film, and I think it was supposed to, right? I mean, like it I think tried to convey that sense of detachment, like the war has happened, you're back, and you're, you know, you've lost most of your friends and you're now living your life, but there's this sense of detachment from the earlier life, and you know, I thought that works artistically.
Agreed, and I thought it really gave the feeling of grief, you know. I mean, his life is never going to be the same. He lost half of his heart literally on that battlefield. So when I was thinking about the religion thing, if you had shoehorned in more elements of religion, you would have lost the time feeling the horrors of war on the battlefield. And that was so pivotal for me to understand the process, but I think also for Tolkien to get to where he was, that if you didn't have those moments and the desperate moments, hearing his friend call his name, running after him, trying to find him, a little too on the nose was the minion Sam, who wouldn't let him. Sam, really?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
So, I mean, there were a few moments where I was like, oh, of course. But in general, I mean, I wouldn't have given up any of that World War I Battle of the Somme, being in the pits, seeing him pass out in that pit filled with water and dead bodies.
Oh, my goodness.
Just knowing that he had to wait there. Like, that hit was more core than...
That was one of the most striking visual images of the entire film, that pit. Yeah.
And seeing him wrap the scarf around his neck, you could just feel how cold and alone and desperate he was. So I feel like we needed that to show that the second half is going to be detached. It's not going to be the warm, optimistic, loving, supportive, joyful thing. It's going to be hard. And we're going to do our best to honor what happened. And I love the line that he says, too, of like, we all came back, or those of us that came back didn't come back unscarred, or something like that. Like, we're dealing with our own injuries.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oof.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Trish was just saying at the same time that she was the Batman Sam was also her an eye roll moment for her. Absolutely.
If I could have a moment for those, there were quite a few eye roll moments where I was like, oh god, the shoehorn is real. Like, they definitely shoved as many things as they could. I was just looking through some images. Let me share my screen real quick. So I was just looking through these. You guys see all the Google images?
Yes.
Yeah. So this one of, you know, he stands up on the edge of the trenches, puts the cloak over his shoulders, and the fires of Mordor in front of him, and then a dragon comes out of the fire. And again, I get it. It was great. I understand the impact, but I couldn't help but be like, again.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one thing I would say there about that, and that was, you know, I mean, you may remember that my least favorite parts of the trailer were like the fantasy bit superimposed over reality, right? The thing that changed that for me a lot, actually, within the first five minutes of the film, right, when I discovered that the whole time they're showing him there in the trenches, he's actually he's feverish already, right? So that those things, it's like fever visions that he's having, and even as we were again discussing it at the bar afterwards, when we saw the film together, the questions as to whether even like when he goes up over the top and goes out across the battlefield at the end, whether that even happened, like had he already collapsed, and is that entire thing a fever sequence in his mind? And that seems to me very likely, or very possible, that we're supposed to understand it that way. So when I found that was the case, right, that all of those images, like the Balrog face and the Sauron or Morgoth standing, I think it was Sauron because it didn't have Silmarils on his hat, but but anyway, you know, all those things, right? And the dragon, as you say, and all that stuff, when I found that he was already like feverish and sort of, you know, losing physical touch with reality, I was fine. That was so much better than merely like he's really miserable and upset and is surrounded by horror and thus retreating into a fantasy world, or making the world around him into a fantasy world, which I think would have been really belittling and insulting. But they didn't do that. They, so that I still wasn't a huge fan of those sequences, but it made it a little bit easier for me.
It wasn't as bad as like twinkling music and a light bulb above his head. It wasn't that obvious. It was more explainable. I think the whole film was also helped by the cinematography and the music, because both of them were absolutely beautiful. So the tone, I think, was very classic period film the whole way through. It was never like, ooh, inspired by, you don't get these cute little kids wearing Hobbit clothes inspiring him and things like that. You get these really heartfelt, deeper, hitting the core moments that impact and make sense. It wasn't taking any cheap shots. It was taking some convenient shots that, you kind of roll your eyes at. But the rest of it, I felt really earned. I found myself super entertained. It was really fun to watch. The only things that I started kind of jotting down in my notes of like, what's with this, what's with that, was the stuff that moved too fast. It was like, you hadn't seen Edith for the 2 years that you've lived here, and then all of a sudden we're sitting at the table and you think she's hot. Like, I'm pretty sure you guys have lived in the same house for a while. So there were just a few like continuity things, and then there were a few things with their relationship where it was condensed into quite serious quite quickly. But they absolutely had to do that because they're trying to fit so much into this 90-minute thing. So as we said with the lens and making the decisions, you've got to cut something and you've got to smush some things. But the positive of that was, like I said before, I think everything they kept worked on a few levels. So they didn't have a scene if it didn't hit for certain reasons. So like even when, which one was it? Was it Jeffrey, whose father was the headmaster?
No, it was Gilson's whose father was the headmaster.
Gilson. So when he stands up to his dad and, has that triumphant moment, that was to show them bonding. That was to show them cutting loose and having a drink and looking at naked pictures, all these things that boys do, but also growing as people and rising up to challenges and standing up to it and changing their future. Like all those things worked. And that should have been 4 different scenes. And it was one scene that hit 4 different points. That was very cool.
Yeah. No, I agree. I thought, Gabriel Schenk was saying earlier that, there could be a criticism for it actually trying to do too much, that it's, is it a love story, an exploration of creative genius, something about fellowship or male bonding, a World War I film, and it tries to do all of those things. He's saying he feels that at times it lacked focus. I agree. I don't think it integrated those things perfectly, right? It could have been, I don't know if it needed to be longer or whatever, or if they needed to try to throttle back their enthusiasm, but I don't know what I would have suggested they cut of those things. I mean, I think that they did all those things well enough to more than justify their presence in the film. But I certainly agree with Gabriel. If they made a mistake, it wasn't in leaving out too much; it was in including too much, potentially. One of the things of the stories, I felt one of those things which seemed to me, and we've already talked about how much we liked it, the love story, right? What did you think, Maggie, about the way that ended? After the hug, right? She buries her face in Tolkien's shoulder and is hugging him in the hospital, right? And we're seeing his face over her shoulder. And from that moment, when she goes down and her face goes out of the picture, we almost never see her. We just see her on the doorstep and she's upset about something, and it's like a little bit unclear what's happening there. We see her walking in the woods with him, but it doesn't feel like
mojo.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like their story really comes to a satisfying kind of. I mean, they get married off screen, for crying out loud, right? I mean, it's like they're just sort of married. Now, here was my.
That's where I think the end is separate, and we thought the lens didn't quite work, So like I said, the lens for me has always been their relationship and how it pushes them into where he goes. So it's like they skipped the bit of us becoming who we actually are. We've got all the setup and then no payoff because we've got 8 minutes left to finish this film, and we have to show him with a shot of him writing about the Hobbit. And instead of showing a building up, they show a struggle. And that's fine, because I'm sure it was a struggle for him to overcome writer's block and learn to write and be creative again. But in terms of a filmic story, you never want to introduce a conflict in the last 8 minutes of a film. So if there's a struggle, it should be a support and a joining of a team. And yes, you've come back from war, you've met your best friend's buddy who passed away, and you want to publish his poems. You're finding your feet under the ground. We're going to get married and do this together, and then we move forward positively. I mean, it didn't throw me because I didn't really think about it until just now when you said that. But in terms of like progression and momentum, her sitting on the ground and being pissed at him was valid, but not helpful in terms of storytelling. So yeah, I would have shelved it and gone back to, let's show this as being a hard chapter, but we're in it together moving forward. Not you got to pull your finger out and stop being self-centered, because that's kind of what it showed.
Right. Well, here's one theory about the lack of resolution, I guess, to Edith's plot thread, right? To the Edith story specifically. You could read it as actually a very daring kind of move on the part of the film. Daring in this way. The fact is, Edith Tolkien's story, is not very clear, right? There's a lot of evidence that we don't have about Edith Tolkien's life, at least that has not been made public. What evidence that there is suggests that Edith Tolkien, although they were happily married and everything, not trying to criticize their marriage, but she does not seem to have lived a completely happy life, right? The story of Edith Tolkien, does the story of Edith Tolkien have a happy ending? I'm not saying that, I'm not asserting that the answer to that question is no. I'm saying it's a question that is there to be asked, and that you can make an argument either way. At the very least, she doesn't get the fairy tale ending, in a lot of ways, especially, Maggie, going back to that scene with their fight that you were talking about, which I also really thought was a really fascinating and interesting move by them. There are no secret literary societies for me, was the line that she said that really stuck with me. Well, there were never secret literary societies for her. That part of Tolkien's life, I'm not saying he never shared anything with her, and I don't know what their marriage was like and the extent to which she was involved in what he was doing. She clearly was in the beginning when she was doing fair copies of his works, and he was sharing his poetry with her. We get less evidence about that in later days, when he's writing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. How involved is Edith? I mean, again, I'm not asking that question in order to imply that she wasn't involved at all. I'm saying I don't know exactly how involved she was.
But we shouldn't be asking that question at the end of the film.
Well, see, exactly. But see, that's the thing, is that to leave the question, so to give them to, if they had closed that plot line, right, the love story plot line, and made it into a happily ever after thing, and they'd given it a full resolution so that we see Edith and Ronald together in this fully resolved relationship, that would have been
more unsettling for you.
Well, no, not more unsettling. It would have been more satisfying.
Oh, okay.
While watching the film, but I'm not sure it wouldn't have been less true to life. The fact that the very lack of resolution to that plot line seems to me to fit, I mean, the fact that I'm left asking the question at the end. So did Edith in the end get what she was hoping for? Did she get the life that she hoped, that she wanted? I don't know.
Against the point of the film for me. I mean, if we're going to do a biopic and we're going to have a dramatic retelling of an element of his life that's really interesting and engaging, it should be tied up with a pretty bow. It doesn't mean it has to have a happy ending, but all of the plots should be circled off and sorted, so you at least have a satisfaction at the end. So opening up to future, sure, but it shouldn't leave you unsettled or unanswered. Yeah, so to me that's a failing in the last 10 minutes. Something's missing.
I can get behind that. That's why I said I thought it was kind of daring. It would have been easy. It would have been super easy for them to, I mean, how long does it take to show a 15-second like wedding montage, right? I mean, like seriously, that wouldn't have been hard. You don't have to do a full scene. If he had come back, so we go from the hospital scene and Father Francis being like, she's a keeper, right? To Tolkien when it, like if we'd gone from that scene and he's like to like, and now they're married and happily ever after, like, and now there's kids and even if we had gotten that, like if the one scene we'd had in between was not the I'm upset with you sitting on the doorstep scene, but like some kind of domestic bliss scene, it'd been fine, right? I the way in which they didn't, I don't know, again, I'm not a filmmaker. It might be, saying too much for me to be like, oh, how hard would that have been? Come on, that's simple.
No,
but it seems simple.
I think that absolutely would have been simple, but I think that's also a cheesy way out. So, I mean, and hey, I'm all for that. I love a happy ending. Bring out the cheese. That's great. But if you also wanted to introduce what some actual things happen in their lives, I feel like you could just do that in a better way. That little fight on the back doorstep of get your writing going didn't quite hit. So I would have preferred if it was a little bit more of a matching of the minds, like we had earlier on in the restaurant and after the meeting where she yells at him. If it had been matched up more with that, where it's not her being pissed off and frustrated and a tired mom, it's her matching him and saying, you can do this, let's do this. That would have felt more like what I picture and what I think we all kind of envision their relationship to be. We don't need to know what happened to Edith, because what we're shown in this story is that they're a team and they work well together. And then all of a sudden we have this thing where she's not on the same team and he's not on the same team and she's just disappointed. And that's not what we should be getting. We should be getting frustration and a push.
I felt like that element of it got a little bit resolved in the strolling with the kids conversation, right? The conversation that, because like the looks that they exchanged and the like encouraging smiles she was giving as he was telling his story, like it doesn't just leave it. If that doorstep scene had been the last one we'd gotten, it would have been deeply unsettling. Because I do agree with you about that.
Or I wonder if maybe we didn't need the doorstep scene. Maybe it could have just been a skip to the woods of I'm frustrated, let's work on this together and pull me out.
Right. Right. Yeah. I don't know. But I don't know. Like I said, I'm not sure if the intention was to leave that kind of unresolved, to leave that a little bit open. I hear you that I think it did feel, I don't know, like a flaw, but it was definitely a thing at the end that I was kind of a little bit nagged by. Like the one of the elements that they didn't close. I thought that, the thing with G.B. Smith's mom was a wonderful way to resolve the TCBS subline, of the story. And then, of course, the way that then dovetails eventually into Tolkien's own publication. I thought that flowed really, really well and was done very well. I thought that the it's not exactly like they came back to the language thing, but to me, the culmination of the language and story and things like that was when he's sitting there translating the Battle of Malden for Joseph Wright while war is being declared, right? That was also not quite, it didn't make me cringe, though that was like, Maggie, when you talk about like on the nose moments, right? Like, Tolkien reading from the Battle of Malden while people are celebrating in the quad that war has been, declared, was a little bit heavy.
There's a lot of those.
Yeah.
However, and the Fellowship. Oh, that line too. Sorry, I'm off on the nose.
Oh, though, that was so much better than in the trailer. Come on. Like the way they spliced that into the trailer was super cheesy. But when he finally got there at the end, like it was detached from everything and kind of I don't know. Like I felt much better about the Fellowship line because it was not, because of the way in which it wasn't just juxtaposed against the TCBS.
Yeah, I feel like all of my criticism should be taken with a grain of salt, because overall I enjoyed it. There were just so many points that I rolled my eyes, and that's kind of a shame because it's just too twee. The Fellowship was not as bad as in the trailer, but it was also interesting to watch the film, and the bits from the trailer were almost all smushed together in the same bits of the film. the ones that tell me the story, adventure, you know,
Yes.
all that stuff was
Yes.
in the same scene in the film. So they just kind of lifted it and plucked it out. So that bit was a little bit eye-rolly because it was set up, but also probably
Yeah.
because we knew that before. When the word fellowship came, I was like, there it is. But I don't know how else I would have finished that. Like, that is what had to be delivered in that moment, especially because they set it up with all of these cheesy lines before that that's the payoff I want, but I'm still going to roll my eyes at it.
Right. Right. No, I hear that.
Yeah. That's fair.
I hear that. Let's see. So there's another thing I just wanted to talk about, and I'm forgetting. Oh yeah. Okay. So let me give my primary objection to the film. Here's the one thing that I think they did least justice to. I am not sure that I have an answer. Like, if I were to issue myself my own challenge of like what exactly would I have wanted to see and how would I have wanted to see it differently, I'm not 100% sure I can answer that. But nevertheless, let me state the thing. They did way more justice to the relationship between language and storytelling than I ever thought they would even attempt to do. What they did not do justice to was, if it was an origin story, if the movie is understood as an origin story of Tolkien as an author, then I think that was fine. If it was an origin story of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, it was a bad origin story, because that is not the story of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. The story. This is the reason why, for me, the last 8 minutes were the most disappointing, because I disliked the whole conversation with his kids in the woods, because of the way in which it gives the impression that he's written nothing, right, for years, which is of course very much not true, right? If they'd been like more historically accurate, then when they're sitting on the doorstep, Edith wouldn't be like, you know, why are you not writing anything? She would be like, are you still working on that alliterative poem? Come on, man.
Right.
Like, what's up with that? Right. You know, so that's not how it happened at all. And again, I'm not saying it's not a documentary, but the way in which they attempted to depict the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, A, as a unit, and B, as like the flowering of all of this unspoken, so like all of these things, right? Like his childhood and his love relationship and his friendships and his war experience were all kind of brewing inside him, and his linguistic studies and love for language. All that stuff was good, and then comes out, you know, flowers forth in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. That seems to me more fundamentally at odds with his life than anything else that they said in the film, because like that is so not how it happened. So that was to me and again, it's not like I really objected. Like, I get the fact The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is all anybody cares about. It's, you know, it's not like I really would have expected them to put more Silmarillion into it. But there were gestures at it, right? Like when when he gives Joseph Wright his notes, right, about his invented languages, and he talks about like writing legends and histories and stuff of, you know, for those languages and stuff. So it's not like no acknowledgement of the fact that he was writing stuff, even the stuff that he puts on his wall, even his drawings.
The wall. Yeah, we see Aragog. Not Aragog. We see Shelob up there, and also.
Yeah. Not Aragog, but
not
Aragog's forebear.
Yeah, my fantasies.
Exactly. Yeah. No, exactly. It's not like they totally skipped it, but I'm not sure how. So again, I'm not sure what I would have done differently. I'm not sure how I would have suggested this. But of course, I mean, I guess really what I'm coming down to is that the origin story of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, the reason that I didn't like it is that I love the origin story of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. Like, to me, the story of how the Lord of the Rings came to be the Lord of the Rings is a much more interesting story than that. It is so much more interesting than like the troubled genius scarred by war who like can't write, and then suddenly brings forth, this work of luminous genius. That's not the story. The actual story is so much cooler. The accidental discovery, like the way that he backs into this has no, the way that he starts The Hobbit as this like totally to him sort of frivolous side thing, which has nothing to do with the serious work that he's writing, and the way that it catches on, and how he gets backed into writing a commercial sequel for this, but then that turns into the I mean, and then all of it comes together, right? I will tell you the tale of Tenuviel, and bam. I mean, that's such a cool story. The way that he discovers, the way that like his story discovers him almost as much as he discovers it. But obviously, it's not like you can do justice to this in 8 minutes, right? So,
no, we're trying to say, well, Gabriel and I were talking about this in our King Arthur and the Inklings class, and we will be talking about a lot more this week because we're starting on Mallory. But it's very much about like recognizing the foundations that are laid, and I think the Tolkien movie did that quite well. We see them reading Sigrid, we see them, being exposed. He can recite Chaucer off the top of his head. There are these beautiful things that just show how ingrained in his being it is. And then we know what that influenced, but the whole audience for Fox Searchlight Films might not, so you better hit it on the nose and say it's going to be The Hobbit. We know it's not. There's so much other stuff that should have been in there, but how else are you going to hit that?
No, I didn't. It's not like I was expecting that they, like when he's in hospital, right, that he would be like, quick, paper, I must write the Fall of Gondolin. Like, I mean, obviously they were not going to do that, right?
Yeah. I do wonder how restricted they were on time, though, because they really ended at 90 minutes on the dot and 3 minutes of trailers. So, like, films rarely do that unless they have some sort of an after contract for TV production or something. So I wonder, like, how restricted they were, because there's no harm, except for maybe budgetary considerations, to add 10 minutes. So I would have wanted them to spread out some of that relationship building early on with Edith, and spread out some of the post-war coming to age of Tolkien, if they wanted to tell that story. Or I would have ended it in the hospital when Father approves, Like, that weird kind of crunchy bit in the middle doesn't quite fit. So either add 10 minutes and let us kind of sit with it and expand, or cut it off at an earlier point that shows us there's going to be a next chapter, and thank God he has all of this mythic import that he can rely on to help explain the stuff that he doesn't know how to deal with right now, because we all know fantasy really helps process real life. But yeah, I think you're right. The last 8 minutes didn't quite hit on that. It was trying to do it and didn't need to.
Tony is asking about rights issues. I don't think there's any restriction to them alluding to things like like the Fall of Gondolin is the title of a published work. Like, you can
alluding is fine. If they use character names and place them into the story, and we're supposed to think that Aragorn is a kid that he went to school with and match that up, that would be problematic. But in terms of alluding to a work that exists, there's no harm in that. And I was thinking about the on the nose elements. It kind of felt like it was trying to be too on the nose. Like the Tolkien family had a say in it. We want you to tell this story. But we know that they had no say in it. They separated themselves as early as they could from this. So it was just kind of interesting to see like how authentic they were, and almost to the point of harming the storytelling. If they'd had a little more artistic license, we wouldn't have been left hanging at the end.
Yeah. And can I just point, I mean, that's a thing that's worth emphasizing, I think. Again, but I hear people complain like that, like they messed with the, I was shocked at how much they did not change. Like they were, in my view, incredibly, so far beyond my expectations, faithful to the facts of Tolkien's life. I mean, just think of the kind of choices that are quite common to make, in adaptations of this kind, or because I mean, it's not a documentary. Again, it's like it's a biopic. It's telling the story of his, it's telling a story of his life. There's so much they could have changed that they didn't change.
They could have made Edith anything. They could have made his friends be different types of people. Like, I got the feeling for script writing. I don't know the process, so I'll be curious to see if there's anything that comes out after about the script process. But I got the feeling that they literally went through his biography and just put down some bullet points of things that actually happened, and then built a script around it. Because it did feel a little shoehorned for most of the film. This is what happens in this chunk. This is what happens in this chunk. We have to get from here to there. How are we going to do it? It felt methodical to the point that I thought it lost a little bit of its natural storytelling ability, but I was still super entertained and it was fun. And
I mean,
I don't think it's going to win any Academy Awards, but I'll watch it again. So it's on that line in the middle.
It's interesting to think, as you say, that it might actually it might actually suffer from being too slavish to the facts of his life. Yeah, no, I mean, it's true. Like, yes, they shifted chronology. Like, yeah, they changed. Yes, in the real world, Tolkien and Edith had been married already for a year before he left for war. Like, yes, that's how it happened. Yes, of course, like they like the most obviously sort of Hollywood change to the chronology, right, was making like the reunion after years meeting between Tolkien and Edith be like on the day that he's getting on the boat to go off to war, right? Like, okay, yes, that's not how it happened. No, he didn't even go on the same boat with Smith. Smith had been in France for like a year before he went over there. He was the last of the TCBS to go to war. Because he stayed at Oxford and finished his degree first, because he was poor and had to finish his degree. And he was really torn about this. You know, all of his friends were enlisting and he felt like a coward for not enlisting, and instead stuck it out and stayed, and they supported him and encouraged him in that and everything. So yeah, like, no, they didn't do any of that stuff, right? They made them all go to war together, and they sort of they shifted his marriage to Edith until after the war to, sort of increase the drama of that. But again, like, I had no problems with any of that. And again, and that's it. If like those are the major changes we get from Tolkien's life, it's incredible how faithful they were. That's why, I mean, going back to where I was 6 months ago or a year ago, like when I was just like hating the fact that I was going to have to someday see this film, I was afraid they were going to be doing, because
too much of the reinvention.
I was afraid they were going to completely reinvent stuff,
Well, and some of the stuff I've worked on is like fan service and fan expectation. So we talked earlier when we did the trailer review, who is this film for? Because it kind of feels like the fans, but they're not totally alienating them, but it's not totally made up, and kind of walking that line. And I always compare adaptation to the first two Harry Potters, because the first two Harry Potters are super authentic. They follow the exact timeline and storyline to the detriment of the film. They're much more boring films. They're very twee and childlike. But by the time the second film had finished, they made billions and knew that they had banked and knew that they had secured their fan base, that they could have some artistic freedom and go on to the third film with Alfonso Cuarón and get all sorts of inventive.
Right.
We didn't have the time to do that in Tolkien. So they had to stay authentic if they wanted to get their fans happy, on board, and coming to the film. I think if they had gone completely off story, they'd piss us off. We wouldn't tell our friends to go see it. You wouldn't post. It would just be these scathing reviews about how they messed up this legendary man. So they'd be shooting themselves, really.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it makes sense. But again, like, kudos to them for, I don't know, like, for even kind of approaching it that way.
Yeah.
It's, there was so much I was afraid they were going to do, for which there would be all kinds of precedent in biopics, right? To just like do largely fictionalized bits. Yeah, exactly. Just kind of riffing off their lives in some ways. Anyway, yeah. So that's, I think, pretty remarkable, where they ended up going and what they ended up doing. I'm trying to think. I thought there was another. I know we're starting to run to where we should begin to think about stopping. Any? Tomas is asking, great question. Maggie, do you know how well did the film do financially?
I can check. Give me a minute.
Yeah. I didn't actually look that up.
Amongst yourselves, I'll be right back.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So I see there are a bunch of people in the questions box talking about, like possibility for a sequel and all that kind of thing. I'd be pretty surprised if we got a sequel to this film. I doubt it's doing well enough that they would pay for a sequel.
Not doing that well. Well, first of all, its budget was 20 million. That's really low. That's right
It's
at the
really
top
low.
end for an indie film, but that's really low in terms of anything that would have wide box office release. So, most films that we see in the cinema are 50 to 80 million
Mhm.
budget. Marvel and Harry Potter and things like that are 120 to 180. So obviously it's much, much lower budget, and I imagine
Yeah.
a lot of that went to the salaries for Nicholas Hoult and Lily Collins.
Hmm.
And the rest of it probably went for period dress and setting and permits because it was beautiful.
Right.
Opening weekend, it made 2.2 million. U.S. gross is 2.8 million. Gross worldwide is 4.5. So that means it made as much in the U.S. as it did in the rest of the world. So if it's only made 4.5 worldwide with a budget of 20 million, that's not great
Yeah.
in terms of financial return. So like financial return, it's not doing that great. Reviews are crazy split. I did say to Corey, I'm going to make a point of saying something about reviews because I feel very strongly about reviews.
Yes.
Reviews are totally split. If I look at a review, I like looking at Rotten Tomatoes or something like that because it's purely just people weighing in how they feel about something. But reviews never and should never change how you feel about a film. You never know who is giving the assignment to that person to write a review. You never know who's paying that person to write a review. You never know what parent company is in charge of that newspaper to write said review. And you never know which audience they're writing for. So I was just saying to Corey before we started, like I was reading headlines of reviews and Entertainment Weeklies versus New York Times versus Rolling Stone were totally different tones because they're always going to write a little bit towards their audience. So
Right.
take it all with a grain of salt. And it really ticks me off when somebody reads a review and then brings that into the cinema as a filmmaker and as a fan. So try your darndest to just have an open mind when you go into a film. Enjoy it,
Hmm.
take from it what you can. And if you want to read reviews later, I often read them later to see if somebody had a different perspective on something that I did or something that I hated that they loved. I want to know why. So I think it's interesting to kind of buffer your own experience, but try as hard as you can to not let it change your experience.
Yeah.
So there's my note. There's my PSA on reviews.
Yeah. No, that it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I sometimes think about this when I hear people talking about reviews, and I'm like, those aren't like, what reason do we have to think that those reviews are just an objective assessment of the film? Anyway. Um, the thing that I've seen some reviewers, so I've not done wide reading among my primary engagement with this film has been within the online Tolkien community, but outside the online Tolkien community, the primary thing that I've heard is that it's boring, right? I mean, that like negative reviewers think that it's boring. I guess I don't know quite what to make of that. Like, I don't
And
know.
I guess I can kind of get it because what I was saying of like, I don't think it's going to win any Academy Awards, but it's also not going to piss off its fan base and we'll probably watch it again. Like, it almost played it a little too safe, but
Hmm.
I think it played it safe well. I
Right.
enjoyed it playing safe, but if it had tried a little bit harder, maybe it would have shaken us a little bit better because it shouldn't matter that it's Tolkien. It should tell a really good story. And I think it told
Right.
a good story, but it told
I think so too.
Tolkien's good story. It was almost too restricted by the story it was trying to tell. But I still enjoyed it. I just don't think
Yep.
it was anything earth shattering.
Right. Right.
But I'm glad I
Yeah.
wasn't pissed off.
I'm amazed I wasn't
I
pissed
know.
off. Yeah. Yeah. So, Tim, yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're not a Tolkien fan and you don't have the context, I guess like I I don't know. I still kind of feel that like there is enough of like a story of interest here that even if you're not a Tolkien fan, it would be interesting. But I suppose there's absolutely no way I can be objective about that. I mean, I have long since lost touch with people who are not what people who are not Tolkien fans think about things like this. And in particular, I can easily imagine that all of the linguistic stuff would be fairly boring for people who don't know Tolkien.
Would it? I'm
I
so sorry
think.
for them.
I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to guess what people find boring
Like,
about it.
I mean, the only thing I could equate it to is like when I see a sports film and somebody shows off their like dribbling skills, I'm like, wow. So this is a literary film. Somebody showed off their literary skills, and I was like, wow.
Right.
I would
Right.
hope that's the same thing. But I don't know. I guess it's a shame.
Yeah. I mean, like the long speech from Joseph Wright about the oak, which I know many people love. So sorry, I forgot who it was. Somebody was mentioning it earlier in the chat box today that that was a really wonderful scene. I agree. That was a really, really fun scene. Would people have found that boring, right? Like, okay, why do we care about the oak tree? I don't know. Whenever you try to, sort of project yourself like this, you'll end up belittling things, and I don't want to do that. But it's, I don't think I can do justice to the non-Tolkienite reaction to the film, so I won't really try. But that is the main thing that I've heard, just that it's dull. I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So good. Well, we should probably stop, as I don't want to be irresponsible in taking up people's day and everything.
I think we should propose that we do this with the film club in a year or so, though. See how it sit with everybody.
That'd be interesting.
Dig in.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks, Maggie, for joining me here today for another fun discussion of the film, and thanks everybody who attended here today. Keep in mind, we have another event coming up in just about 45 minutes. Trish Lambert is doing her thesis theater, so you can come back if you're on Twitch. Stay here on this same channel, and I'll broadcast it there. But anyway, thanks for coming here today. Yes, and Ryan, we will be uploading this to YouTube, as we always do, all of our stuff. So, all right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Maggie. See you guys later. Bye.